Good practice at least.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Can you see me okay? If not, please do pop a message in chat. We'll try and fix that for you. I say we try and fix it for you. This is our maiden voyage, our first webinar ever. So we don't necessarily know how all the buttons work yet or how to drive this thing, but we'll do our best. Just give everybody a minute or two to come in and get settled, and then we'll kick off. I was going to take this webinar from home, but I've got a 3-year-old daughter, and anybody with kids will know how unpredictable they are. So I thought it was safer to come into the office. So me and Ross are actually sat in the same building right now. Ross is on the other side of the room, not because either of us smell, just because we're trying to keep the feedback down to a minimum. Hi, Ross.
Hi, John.
Hello. Does it sound all right your end?
Sounds good, yeah. And nice and clear.
All right. Shall we make a start?
Yeah, why not?
Okay. Right, everybody. My name's John Graham. I'm the director at Dwell Estate and Letting Agency based in North Leeds, Far Headingley. For any of you that know the area, I'm sure most of you do. I've been working in the industry for around 20 years now, 19 to be exact. And I started in 2004, where I actually met Ross in the same company, and we've been friends and colleagues ever since then. And we both went on to become managers, and then I left there 11 years ago to set up this company, and here we are now. So I've been a Property Mark member for around 15 years now, and I'm also an investor and a landlord with a small portfolio of properties, including single lets, HMOs, and serviced accommodation. So I definitely see things from that side of the fence as well. Our mission here is to help landlords to be well informed, to stay advised, keep on ahead of the curve, and to have their properties run in the background as passively as possible, so they've got time to spend on the more important things in life, such as their own careers and families, while their property generates an income and long-term capital growth. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to dive into a property market update in a minute. We're going to look at how house prices are performing and rental prices as well. I'll take some questions if there are any, and then I'll hand over to our compliance expert, Ross, who's going to talk a little bit about the Renters Reform Bill, which has been one of the biggest things to happen in our industry from a legislation point of view for decades. It's a pretty major overhaul. It's going to affect us all as landlords in a big way. Right, so let's dive into this then. So landlord fines are a big thing, eye-watering in fact, and we've got one example here. Mr. Jack Collins from Leeds was recently ordered to pay £59,217 by Leeds City Council over a 3-year period. Mr. Collins has now been banned from being a landlord as well, and the fines related to a couple of things, largely disrepair of property, so things like no heating and hot water, rotten windows, electrical cables that are exposed, no fire alarms or broken fire alarms. Also, non-compliance of in a selective licensing area. So, we had a couple of properties in selective licensing areas where you need a license, hadn't got one, and those are pretty chunky fines as well. So, all added up to nearly £60,000, if you can believe that. And that's not unique. Most fines are in the region of kind of £2,000 to £4,000 per incident for any non-compliance. And then if you get into licensing issues, that's generally much higher of the order, sort of £15,000 to £30,000. So as a landlord, especially if you're self-managing, you really need to know all this stuff. And there's 167 pieces of legislation that surround lettings and management and landlording. And so that's the buck stops with you. You've really got to understand this stuff. The powers of the councils are increasing to come after landlords for non-compliance. They're being given more resources. Legislation's been stacked up. And not only that, there's going to be a new redress scheme, which is mandatory, or is going to be mandatory when the legislation comes in next year. And that redress scheme is also going to have the power to hand out some pretty hefty fines for non-compliance. So things are only going to get worse in that respect, I'm afraid. Right, so what's happening in the property market? So in the sales market, we can see in the last 12 months an annual growth of 3.5% to take the average house price to £286,000 nationwide. That said, things are slowing down. So in the last 8 months, we've seen seven months of negative house price growth, or deflation, if you like. With the exception being last month in May, where property prices jumped by 1.8%, which is it's often what you see in spring, but actually a higher jump than normal. But the brakes are being put on again in June, and we all know why. It's basically boils down to interest rates. So mortgage approvals, the brokers are not having such a good time of things at the moment, compared with the last few years, especially. So mortgage approvals down by 26%. And actually a massive 40% reduction in gross mortgage lending in the last year alone, which is huge. But putting that into context, lending levels were way higher than normal during the pandemic. And actually, when you look at these stats, things are in the housing market are returning to a more normal level than we've seen for the last couple of years, which is pandemic induced. So residential transactions are 25% down, but more in line with what we'd normally expect as an average. All of this, as I say, is driven by inflation. We'll all remember the debacle going on in Parliament in the autumn and the autumn budget, which sent mortgage rates into a huge spike. And things were settling down again. Rates were coming down, but at the same time, inflation's remained stubbornly high, which peaked at nearly 12% a few months ago, and it's still stuck at 8.7% last month. So this is the reason why the Bank of England have increased the base rate by 0.5% last week to 5.0%. Unfortunately, there's a bit more sting in the tail to come, and we think that interest rates are going to continue to go up. The base rate is going to go up by another 0.5 to another 1% before this is played out and inflation's under control. So this is a big shock, and it can't be underestimated, and landlords particularly are feeling it. But anybody on a variable rate mortgage or anybody needing a new mortgage is going to be having an eye-watering surprise if they're not already aware of what's happening, because we've got used to this rock bottom base rate at kind of way less than 1% for a very long time, going right down to 0.1%, and then the rises started around the middle of 2021. So you can see from the graph, we've gone from pretty much 0 all the way up to 5% in a relatively short space of time. And that is having a massive effect on the housing market. So here we've got an interesting chart from Zoopla showing that demand is down by 14% from buyers, which is pretty significant. But at the same time, the number of sales agreed is up by 11%, and the flow of new properties to the market has increased by 16%, which is fantastic news. So as a result of that, homes available for sale are 10% up, and that will be a massive relief for anybody who's been wanting to move during the pandemic but has been stuck because nothing available to buy, and that's been a huge issue. So there are actually a lot of positive signs in the market, and anything that's coming to market now that's well priced is generally selling quite quickly. This slide from Property Mark shows, reinforces the same message in that 30% of the number of buyers registered per member branch is down 30% in April compared to the April prior, whilst the number of properties is 70% higher than it was last April, which is good news for many. And then taking a look at the regional picture, we can see this region by region. The left-hand number is monthly change, the middle number is annual change, and the far right-hand number is average time to sell in days. So you can see for Yorkshire and Humber, annually we had 2.4% growth with minus 0.5% last month, which is pretty similar to the rest of the UK. Actually, when you delve deeper into that, you can see that Yorkshire fared better in the short term, having less negative growth in the last 6 months than most of the regions. And within that, we're in Leeds. Leeds tends to perform better than Yorkshire and Humber in terms of these statistics as well. And then the number of days to sell is increasing and edging up slightly month by month, which is what you'd expect in a cooling market anyway. And Yorkshire performing better than most other areas, so generally taking between 55 and 65 days to sell wherever you are in England and Wales. Should just mention conveyancing times at this point as well, because they've really slowed down during the pandemic. Solicitors had a pretty hard ride of it, and things ground to a halt in many cases. That's coming down now, so you're generally back more in line with more normal conveyancing times. So you can typically accept about 90 days in conveyancing. So you put that together with your 60 days or 55 days, being sold subject to contract, you're looking at about 150 days from putting the property on the market to giving the keys to the buyer as an average. That will depend partly on leasehold versus freehold. Leasehold sales are taking longer. There's more paperwork coming in there as well. That's typically taking about a month longer than a leasehold sale at the moment. So let's move on to the rental market. The cost of renting is shooting up at an eye-watering pace as well. So this is quite a frightening chart showing rental demand, the increase in rental demand, first of all, on the right-hand side. This is the 4 weeks to 11th of June versus the 5-year average, and demand for rental properties is up between 40% and 90%, depending on which region you're in. That is absolutely huge, as you can imagine. And then looking against the supply of properties at the same time, that's reduced between looking at the graph, between 13% and around 40% at the same time. So it's not easy to conclude that that's going to have a significant effect on rental prices. And those looking to rent are having a really tough time right now. So this chart shows rental growth versus earnings, which we can see here. There was a big spike that started around April 2021. and that's gone almost vertical. So we're up to, that peaked at around 12% year-on-year rental price inflation, or rent inflation. It's still well into double digits now, and it's not showing a lot of signs of slowing down. Compare that to the increasing earnings. That's currently sitting at 6.7% as an average nationwide, and that's just nowhere near keeping up with rents or even CPI for that matter. Just a couple of other points on that one. Just bear with me a moment while I catch up with my notes. There we go. Okay, so this one shows how this financial pressure is filtering through to tenants. You can see from this slide that in the last 6 months alone, the majority of tenants have had a rent increase. There's been a 50% increase in tenants finding it very difficult to pay rent, and double the amount of tenants are falling behind with rents, and that's just in the last 6 months. So the question is, how long will this continue and how sustainable is it? Sadly, it appears it's a trend that shows no sign of slowing down. Increasingly, rents are one of the reasons for landlords to stick around in the market, but what we need to remember is that although landlords can and sometimes have no choice to charge more rent, many of them would rather not do that. They don't want their tenants to struggle financially, and despite the bad press, you know, they want to be on the tenant's side and help them as much as they can. One solution to this is rent protection, which is an insurance product that we believe in here, and it covers the landlord in case of non-payment of rent or where tenants can no longer afford to pay, which is sadly becoming more and more of the norm. And it also covers legal expenses, for example, where an eviction is required, and that can run into several thousands of pounds. So we've got a significant portion of our managed landlords who have a rent protection policy. It's a small monthly amount, which is not really noticeable, and it covers all of that stuff, which I think is really, really helpful. But despite increasing rents, landlords do continue to sell in large numbers, and the reasons are mostly increasing interest rates, which we've discussed, more tax to pay now. So within that, there's been the removal of Section 24, which started back in 2016 with George Osborne, which basically phased out any relief that we had against mortgage interest. So effectively, landlords are paying tax on income rather than profit, which is the only business I know of that does that. It's pretty crazy. And my opinion is that the government really needs to consider scrapping that now, because we have to re-incentivize landlords to stay in the market or to come to the market. There's been increased rates of stamp duty for landlords. So we had the 3% surcharge, which is still there, despite first-time buyers getting a break. There's been a reduction on capital gains allowances as well for landlords, and they've been halved and then halved again. So it leaves pretty much 0-0 rate band now on capital gains. And then there's been increased legislation. So Ross is going to tell us all about the rental reform bill in a moment. But things like removal of Section 21 fixed term tenancies, that's frightening landlords away as well. No ban allowed coming for pets or for children or for people on benefits. And then increasing fines and liability on landlords as well. So really, there couldn't have been a worse time for the rental reform bill to come into play. Okay, so not many questions in the chat box. So if Ross, if you're okay to pick up, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Yeah, I mean, just to comment on a few things that John pointed out there. Obviously, there's a lot of potential doom and gloom, but there's also potential, a lot of potential positives in all of that. I think, as landlords, interest rates have gone up, mortgage prices have gone up, but if you look at the rent increases over the last 2 years alone, the properties we're doing rent increases sometimes between £100 to £200 per tenancy, mainly where tenants haven't had their rent increased for a number of years, but landlords are now feeling the pinch, and that care they're offering to their tenants by not increasing the rents, not wanting to upset their tenants, has kind of gone out the window a bit, and they've now brought their rents up to current market values. So, there's still a lot of big wins for landlords to have in the market if you do proactively manage your properties. So obviously for our landlords, we do regularly look at the rent reviews and try and keep them to the current market levels wherever possible. Most landlords will be happy to receive those increases. Some landlords still want to keep the rents low to keep their tenants happy. It's an individual choice, but certainly that's something that we want to be doing with our clients, is making sure the rent levels are increasing as much as possible, so that when these changes do come in, you do get hit with the increased interest rates and the increased charges and the reduction in tax relief, everything else, you're making the most from your properties just by increasing the rent, which is the easy thing you can do. And looking at the stats on just how much property demand has gone through the roof versus property supply, that in itself has driven the rent up as well. So, that may continue.
I think it's worth bearing in mind as well that although interest rates are at a shocking level at the moment, it's not going to be like that forever. They are going to level off. They're going to come down again. And this presents some opportunities for buying as well. There's a lot of motivated sellers out there now who are stuck on high interest rates, who are very keen to get off that as soon as possible. So we're now finding that there are deals available for investors to pick up. If you've got cash, you're in a fantastic position right now. You haven't got the interest rates problem. To buy cash, you can get a better deal. You could refinance again in 12 months' time. Put your money in it now, get your money back out in 12 months' time. So there's opportunities coming up as a result of all this, which we can't forget. And it's a short-term problem with interest rates. I think they're never going to go back down to where they were at the rock bottom. We've got to get used to that. But they are artificially high now at 5-6% or going to 6%. So
I think that those landlords that are what we call accidental landlords, so never really intend to become a landlord. They didn't buy the property they rent out with the intention of being a landlord. They only got into it by accident. They possibly found it as a get-rich-quick scheme, and property really is not a get-rich-quick scheme, especially being a landlord. It's over a long period of time. You're allowing somebody else to pay off your mortgage, rather than presenting you with a second income from one or two properties. That's just not the way it was. And I'm sure there are people out there who are old enough to remember what the interest rates were like, 30, 40 years ago, when they were considerably higher than they are now. So like John says, we've rode the wave of low interest rates for quite a while and got used to it. And I think that's part of the problem. People just got used to not paying a lot on the mortgages. I was speaking to a mortgage advisor last night, and he was saying the 1 year fixed mortgage is becoming a lot more used at the moment. So that's a possibility for you as well, just to try and ride it out. No one knows what the future will hold, but you've just got to make sure you make the best of your portfolio. And like John says, the opportunities are there to potentially buy these properties for these landlords that are these accidental landlords that have decided that enough's enough. They can't be bothered with the change of legislation, the change of requirements, and the decrease in the amounts they're receiving on a monthly basis. So some potentially good investment opportunities out there, so keep an eye out for them. We work a lot with investors doing off-market sales, selling properties with tenants in situ, so it becomes a ready-made deal, turnkey deal from day one where you're getting rental income. So if anybody is interested in that, then certainly get in touch with us. We can have a chat to you about those investment services. But let's move on now and go on to the Renters Reform Bill, as I know a lot of people have joined to find this information out. So I'm going to go through in 4 sections regarding the Reform Bill. So firstly, what is its purpose? What is it there for? What's it meant to be doing? What are the timescales involved? Because there are a lot of scaremongering going on at the moment. People not really understanding the change in legislation and what it entails and when it's going to happen. What are the proposed legislation changes? So exactly what are they going to change? And then ultimately, what does this mean for our landlords? So what is its purpose? So the legislation will implement many of the measures that the UK government included in the A Fairer Private Rented Sector White Paper, which was published in June 2022. And then the Renters Reform Bill is really the result of a lot of those measures. The objective of the bill ultimately is just to ensure that renters have got access to a secure and decent home, and that landlords retain the confidence to repossess their properties where they need to. Now, this has been one of the biggest issues for people with the not knowing the full ins and outs of how the Reform Bill will work is the worry that they can never get their property back when you abolish the Section 21 notice. How do I get my tenants leave if I ever want to sell? So we'll go through that in a bit more detail further in through the presentation. It introduces more possession grounds where tenants are at fault. For example, in the case of any antisocial behaviour or repeated rent arrears for tenants. So even though they've abolished the Section 21 or going to abolish Section 21, they have reinforced the Section 8 notice and the grounds in which you can get possession under Section 8. It does provide stronger protections against retaliatory evictions. So landlords wanting to get rid of tenants who are continuously making complaints about the standard of their property. So rather than being a good landlord and just fixing the problem, some landlords will just evict their tenants, move to the next tenant, hoping that they will not make the same complaints. But ultimately, they should just be fixing their property, and that when that's what it becomes with the decent home standard, and making sure that all rental properties in the UK are of a good habitable standard. So again, apply decent home standards to the private rental sector, making it illegal for landlords and agents to have blanket bans on renting to tenants in receipt of benefits or with children. As John mentioned earlier, we'll go into that in a bit more detail further on. But it's something that I think a lot of landlords and agents have done historically. Is you'll see on the advert saying no DSS or no children. I mean, ultimately, as a landlord, you've got to make a decision what is right for your property, but you can't make broad sweeping judgments across the board. You have to consider all tenants and then make the right decision for your property. And then the other thing the bill is going to do is strengthen the local council's enforcement powers and also introducing new requirements for councils to report on enforcement activity. So I'm assuming that councils, when they're required to publish their records for how many rogue landlords they've brought to task, or how many substandard properties they've put orders on where the works are required to be done to bring the standards up, they'll be shouting about that. So they'll be going out looking for these properties and these landlords to hold accountable. So timescales. So obviously, what is the process and where we're at now, and when will things affect us? So the general process normally takes around 9 to 12 months. The first reading is what's called stage 1, where the bill was introduced into Parliament, happened on the 17th of May this year, which is when obviously all the media stories started coming out about what was happening and all the changes that were being made. They then started the second reading in Parliament. It was due to start on the 5th of June. I believe it did start around that time frame. And that's kind of the stage we're at the moment, is going through the second reading, where they're going to go debate on the main principles amongst MPs. They'll then go through looking at line by line discussion on the bill, discussing the pros and cons of each. Industry bodies like Property Mark will be having a voice in that and working with the government to make sure that the decisions that are made are practical and are not going to break the industry, that potentially some MPs might not fully understand. What are the practical implications of these changes? How are the people on the ground actually going to get affected by these changes? After that, they'll get to the reporting stage, where all the amendments that have been proposed, where all they're discussed. Then they'll go to the third reading, which is done very shortly after the reporting stage. And then after that, it gets approved by the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And at that point, it's then put forward for royal assent before becoming law. And that's when it's referred to as an act as opposed to a bill. So 9 to 12 months from sort of May. So we're expecting it to come into play at the start of 2024. And then there will be a transition period. So they'll make it law, and every new tenancy will have to abide by law from the day that the act comes into play. And then there'll be a transition period, which is normally around 6 months. And after that, all existing tenancies will also have to comply with the new legislation. That bit on the right, the images there, they have taken those from the actual government website. It says it's in the second reading. I have a feeling it's at the committee stage now, but that's what the actual government website is stating. It's at that stage currently. So what are the proposed legislation changes? The main changes I think that everyone's heard about and is worried about is the fact that they're abolishing the fixed term tenancies, and this is a huge shake-up in our industry. Completely changes the way that the tenancy application process is done, and the way that the planning, if you like, for landlords on their asset and their portfolio, about how they used to be able to tie tenants in for the longest time period to give them security of tenancy. The difference being now that from day one, it's automatically a rolling periodic tenancy. So there are no more fixed term tenancies when this comes into play. The tenants will still be required to give notice to end the tenancies. They'll be moving from a 1 month notice period up to a 2 month notice period. And we're still unsure whether the tenants will be allowed to give notice on day one and 2 months from that day, or whether it will be 2 months from the next rent due date, in effect making the shortest term tenancy they can do be 3 months. So I'm assuming that's something they'll thrash out in the House of Commons and then come up with up to a decision on how best to proceed. The next thing on there, obviously abolishing the Section 21 no fault eviction. We've touched on this a bit previously. The Section 21 was the notice that a landlord could give a tenant where you did not have to give a reason why you were asking that tenant to leave. So if you had a tenant that was causing you a few issues, or you weren't getting on with, or was just persistently a few days late with the rent, difficult to deal with, rather than giving them a Section 8 notice and listing all the grounds under which you were applying for possession, you could just serve a Section 21 notice, giving 2 months notice to evict the tenant, ending the tenancy outside the fixed term on that 2 months notice, and it's classed as no fault eviction. So if you ever went to court, the judge would have to give grant possession because it's a mandatory grounds for possession. But what they have done, even though they've got rid of the Section 21 no fault eviction, they've reinforced Section 8 notice and added additional grounds for possession under the Section 8, especially where the tenants are at fault for things like antisocial behaviour or repeat rent arrears offences. And I'll go through in more detail the grounds, the new grounds for Section 8 on the next slide, I believe it is. They are introducing a new ombudsman that all private landlords must join. So currently, letting agents are required to be a member of a redress scheme. There's a number of options out there. You don't have to be a member of the ombudsman, but that is one of the options you can go through. We are a member of the PRS for redress, but currently no landlord is required to be a member of the ombudsman. So ultimately, the tenants, if they have an issue with landlords, the only people they can complain to are the governing bodies that look after the redress schemes, that look after the agencies. This is probably a good thing for us as an agent, because when we're stuck in the middle between a rock and a hard place between a tenant and a landlord, where a landlord is not upholding their requirements and obligations, the tenants ultimately will blame us because they're the ones that we speak to them, and that we are the easy people to blame. I did have a case this year where the tenant put a complaint forward against Dwell, but in the complaint they said that Dwell were fantastic, but the landlord was not doing repairs as quickly as they would like. So the complaint got thrown out because they're complaining about Dwell, but not actually complaining about Dwell. So this is something as landlords you are going to have to do. So if you're a private landlord, you do need to make sure that you do register, and there will be fines for non-registry. Again, we'll go through those details later on. And they'll also be introducing a new property portal, where there'll be a database where all residential landlords and private rental properties will be registered, so that they can, in effect, black mark properties or landlords. So as an agent, when we take a new property onto market, we will be checking that property and that landlord are registered, and there's no black marks against their name for whatever reason, to making sure they are still legally allowed to be a landlord and to rent out that property. Giving tenants the right to request a pet in their property has come up quite a lot in the media. It does say the landlord must consider and cannot unreasonably refuse the tenant to have a pet. There's a couple of caveats to that, which is not overly publicised. If you have a superior landlord or a superior sort of head lease on properties, normally leasehold properties, which state that you can't have a pet in the building, so blocks of flats. If your superior landlord or the head lease states no pets, then that is a reasonable ground for the landlord to say to their tenant, unfortunately, not allowed pets. So that will continue to be the same case. If the landlord does, or the tenant is allowed to request a pet, the landlord must consider it. It's a 42-day consultation period that the landlord has to consider that tenant's request and then come back to them with a reason. One thing which they are going to implement, which is not really, it doesn't really happen a lot at the moment, is pet insurance. So it is expected that there'll be quite a lot of pet insurance products that are out there where landlords can insist that the tenant takes out a pet insurance to cover any damage caused by that pet. Obviously, deposits are capped at 5 weeks' rent currently, but there are provisions sort of like deposit replacement schemes where you can get a higher level of protection as landlord. But this is specific pet insurance to cover damage caused by pets. Now, I don't think that will work in the way it's initially proposed, where the tenant is able to take out, or the landlord is able to insist the tenant takes out the policy. Because if the policy is in the tenant's name, the landlord has no control whether that policy is kept in place throughout the tenancy or whether the tenant cancels it. So one recommendation that I will certainly be backing is the requirement for the landlord to take out pet insurance and increase the rent to cover that cost, on the understanding that the tenant is paying for that pet insurance through the rent increase. That means the landlord has full control and can make claims themselves for any damage by the tenant. And that, in my opinion, will be a much better way of running it and making it happen. But we'll have to see what comes out in the readings through Parliament with all the changes as they're discussed. So some further measures the UK government will legislate for include applying, like I said, the decent home standard for the parliamentary sector, making it illegal for landlords and agents to have blanket bans on renting to tenants receive benefits for children, as we mentioned, and then obviously strengthening the local council's enforcement powers, as we mentioned before, and the council's requirement to report enforcement activity. So that's kind of a general overview of most of the main changes. I would say the Renters Reform Bill is an 89-page document. It's not a small piece of legislation. It's quite a lot in there to go through. If you want to have a look at it, you can just go onto the government website, type in Renters Reform Bill, and you can just download a copy. And if you want some bedtime reading, it is there for everyone to see. Okay, so the new Section 8 grounds. I'll put this in here really to put people's minds at rest and do away with the fears of not being able to get your property back. So ground 1, a new ground within Section 8, will be for a landlord moving back into the property or a family member wanting to move back into the property. This will become a mandatory ground for possession. So again, if it goes to court, the judge can't say no if you've put this ground in there and you are intending to sell the property. Sorry, if you're intending to move back into the property yourself or have a family member move into the property instead. Ground 1A is with the landlord's intention to sell the property. So again, this is mandatory ground for possession. It's not clear yet how this will work, and I'm sure there'll be some loopholes somewhere for landlords who claim they're going to sell the property, put it on the market for a day, and then try and re-let it straight after that just to get rid of the tenants. I'm sure they will think about this when they thrash out the terms of the bill. And this is certainly something that the guys at Property Mark have raised as a potential issue, and are waiting for clarification how that will actually be enforceable and how it will be managed. It says in it's also allowed for the mortgagee where they require a sale, or where the leasehold, where the leaseholder requires a sale as well. They will again be required or be mandatory grounds for possession. So don't worry about not being able to get your property back if you want to sell it, or if you want to move back into yourself, you'll still be able to do that under the Section 8 instead of using the Section 21. So ground 7. So this is obviously where a tenant or a guest of the tenant is committing an offence, but it's where they're convicted or where there's been harassment or antisocial behaviour. It's a mandatory grounds for eviction if the tenant has been convicted. So if they've been charged, or if you have suspicion that they're conducting illegal activity in the property or anything like that, you won't be able to get a mandatory ground for possession, but you would be able to apply to court for a discretionary grounds on those suspicions. So if you have a case where you've done an inspection of a property and you've found drugs in the property, or you suspect your tenant is dealing drugs from the property, if the evidence is there, it's highly likely that you would be granted possession, but it's not guaranteed until the tenant has been convicted. It'll be a 4 weeks notice with immediate effect, but then the judge again will have to give 14 days after the judgment to get possession of the property. Ground 14, so this is for use where a tenant, where it says they're capable of causing a nuisance or annoyance. It's not clear what the definition actually means yet and how it will be implemented. So again, that's one for clarity later on. But it would be an immediate notice with 14 days before the judge is required to order possession. And again, mandatory if there's been a conviction. But if no conviction in place, it'll be discretionary again. So ground 8, this is one that's commonly used currently, most commonly. So if you have a tenant who's in rent arrears, you'll generally serve a Section 8 under grounds 8, 10, and 11. So where the tenant is currently 2 months in arrears at the point of serving the notice, and where the tenant has some amount of arrears, and when the tenant is persistently late with paying the rent. They're the 3 grounds which you'd use for that possession. It'll work in very much the same way as it does now, but the notice period currently is 2 weeks. You have to give the tenant, where this will be extended to, that's one bit now, where we 2 weeks notice, will be extended to 4 weeks notice. So just a slightly longer notice period, 2 weeks rather than 4 weeks, before the judge will be able to grant possession. Ground 8A, now this is a slight change and a new one for the persistent late payment of rent from the tenant. So the only way this will become a mandatory ground for possession is if you can prove that the tenant has been in arrears or been in 2 months arrears on 3 separate occasions over a 3-year period. So it's quite a long period of time. So because at the moment under Section 8, if you apply to the court's possession where the tenant's 2 months in arrears and then they pay £1 of rent before that court hearing, they're no longer 2 full months in arrears potentially, and therefore the Section 8 would not stand up. So this is for use when you have a persistently late payer of rent for the tenant. But they're the main changes for the Section 8. There's a lot in there to digest. And again, as a managing agent at Dwell, we do this for our landlords. I actually personally do the Section 8s because they are very tricky to do. There's a lot of detail you have to get right. And if you get any part of it wrong, it can be thrown out and you've wasted a lot of legal fees and time when you're trying to get your possession of your property back. So if you are self-managing and you're looking to do Section 8s, I would probably be advising to go through a solicitor to do it. But just bear in mind, they will charge you an absolute packet for that privilege, whereas a managing agent like ourselves would do it for a fraction of the cost as part of our management service. And then last slide. So what does this mean for landlords? I mean, ultimately, it's just increased compliance. You need to know more, you need to do more, or you need to give it over to a managing agent who knows what they need to do for you. The penalties, as John mentioned earlier on, are quite staggering. The Ombudsman can ask you to do 3 things. They can ask you to apologise formally to your tenant. Go with your tail between your legs, say sorry. They can require you to fix and repair the property and all the issues that the tenants raised. But they can also issue fines up to £25,000, which you're then required to pay. And obviously non-compliance and non-payments will then result in further slap on the wrist and actions taken. And then you've got the local council, which is where I think most of the fines will come from, where they'll issue fines anything between £5,000 to £30,000, as well as possible prosecutions, banning orders. And like John mentioned with the example he gave with a Leeds landlord who's fined nearly £60,000 and was banned from being a landlord. I mean, to be fair, I personally think this is not a bad thing, because this will get rid of those bad landlords who shouldn't be landlords, that shouldn't be offering properties to tenants that are substandard. But what you just have to make sure is that if you are a good landlord with a good property, you just don't fall foul of the legislation changes. You keep up to speed with it. You do what you're required to do, and you just get on with it, or you hand it over to somebody else to look after it on your behalf. And don't panic. It's not as bad as you think. don't listen to all the scaremongering in the media. Let's wait for the bill to go through Parliament. Let's wait to hear what the changes are. Let's wait to see what the final product actually looks like, and then we'll make judgments based on it. But in the whole, I think these are generally positive for the industry because it will weed out these rogue landlords and properties. And then ultimately, when these landlords are not allowed to rent their properties out or be a landlord, there could be some good investment opportunities. If they don't want to spend the money bringing it up to the right standard, they don't have the appetite for it, then there potentially could be some good investment to buy if you're looking to further increase your portfolio. So it may seem doom and gloom from the outset, but I think if you look into it in more detail and just let it play out, I don't think it's as bad as everyone thinks. The main changes really are the no fixed term tenancies and the abolishment of the Section 21. Section 21, I wouldn't worry about because Section 8 will cover that, but the abolishment of the fixed term tenancy is going to be the biggest thing for people to get their head around. But it's an industry change, like John said. It's one of the biggest we've had in our careers. But it's not something that we can't get over and deal with. Tenants will want to stay. Tenants don't want short-term tenancies. They want long-term security. The difference being that landlords can't offer them that now. So it'll work both ways. But there'll be some that play the system. But I think in the whole, most people will be absolutely fine with it. Just carry on as normal. Just having a quick look in the chat box if anyone's got any questions. Sorry, John.
I was just going to say, Ross, I think one of the reasons for the lack of questions, I've had a couple of emails from people saying that they can't get on with the link. So we need to check the automation settings, but it appears there might be a problem there. So to anybody who couldn't get on, who's now watching the recording, we're very, very sorry about that. As I said, this is our maiden voyage with webinars, and we're using the template automation, which you would expect would have the right links in. And if it doesn't, we are extremely sorry for that.
Hopefully it's just the second time round in the recording.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get there. One thing you touched on, Ross, was another big thing that's coming in with the Renters Reform Bill is the national database of properties and landlords. Now, that is going to be funded by landlords. It's going to be there's going to be compliance built into that.
Yeah, I should have said you need to pay to list yourself. Yep.
Yes, so there's going to be a fee. We don't know how much the fee is going to be. It's going to be what they've termed fair and proportionate, whatever that means. But I suppose my question to you, Ross, is that any different from a national licensing scheme in the same vein as a selective licensing scheme, albeit the cost might be different, or you'd certainly hope so, because it's very expensive for a selective license?
Yeah, I think it is different because obviously if you are a landlord with properties all over the country and you are banned, that means you as a landlord cannot be a landlord. So it doesn't matter if your property is in a selective licensing area. And I suppose if it was it is. It's not a selective license. It's a national licensing of landlords across the country. Exactly, so it's probably an evolved version of the selective license. But I can't see it working any differently. In Leeds, we have 3 sort of main areas in Leeds where landlords are required to register themselves on their properties under the selective licensing requirements. I think that the issue will be because the landlords can't then, if they can't let their property out in that area, they can just move to a different area. I think that's where the difference will come. Whether the councils will talk to each other currently is probably unlikely, and the fact that it's a national database and it's nationally run would hopefully help, weed out these rogue landlords more.
But I think it's worth mentioning as well, the rogue landlords are in a very small minority, and it's a little bit like with some of these fines, it's a little bit like a sledgehammer to crack a nut. But I think they are making an example of landlords, and it's a stark warning to get it right, basically. And the other thing is that the government have said they want to keep the selective licensing scheme in place, which is surely is nothing more than a money-making scheme now. If we have this national register of landlords, where they're paying for that as well,
I'm sure they'll justify that with property visits. Obviously, at the moment with the proposed national database, there's no property visits, whereas the council, the way they're justifying their fee for selective licensing is that they come out and they inspect the properties. Or there's one way they justify their fee. So if there's no property inspections, obviously the cost is going to be a lot less. I mean, selective licensing, what is about £300?
No, it's more than that. It's you pay it in two
Two
parts.
parts. Yeah.
Basically, I think it's about £850 every 5 years, isn't it? So that's a lot of money for.
Yeah,
for
so it was 400 and 425 pounds paid in 2 installments, I think.
Yeah,
my last memory.
Yeah.
And most of those that I spoke to landlords about it, the council never actually got around to inspecting them because of COVID. So you've got a massive backlog.
Exactly.
So
yeah,
different conversation, but we'll see how it comes out in the wash. But
yes,
I can't imagine they would do both.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Okay. Ross mentioned earlier, for those thinking about selling, we do have a service, just to give this a little pitch, not a big one, where we match up off-market. So we have an off-market service where we match up buyers who are looking to buy and landlords who are looking to sell. And we are actively looking for, we've got paid adverts. We're talking to investors with cash and those looking for mortgages as well, who are still very serious about buying. And we're getting the properties in front of them all the time. So if you are thinking about selling, do come and talk to us about that. It's a very, very efficient service. It's working very well.
I had a very good conversation with an investor from Holland yesterday. So it's not just UK investors, it's international as well. People looking to buy properties in the UK. And he was looking to buy a number of properties himself, but also was working with other investors. So there's lots of people still with an appetite to buy, and which is why I said that these potential change in legislation could give up lots of opportunities if you are looking to increase your portfolio and further invest. So yeah, like John says, come and talk to us.
Yeah, and then just one final thing, we do have an offer for a free compliance health check. It's designed for self-managing landlords primarily. It's a video call. Usually takes about 30 minutes, and we're just going to go through and check all the compliance for your tenancy. And what we say with this is, we're not here to judge. That's not what it's about. It's about helping you get it right. Tidying anything that needs tidying up, we can help you with. Or you can do it yourself. There's no obligation with this. We're just going to point out where the gaps are, which boxes you need to check, and hopefully that's a help. So if that's of interest, we'll be sending around a link to that, and then you can just sign up and book in with either Ross or myself and go through.
Yeah, I would say I'm not sure how long we're going to keep doing this for, because at the moment I'm making several calls every day to help people out. It's just our way of giving back, but it does take a lot of time. And like John says, there is no judgment. Most of the people I speak to believe they are compliant, but they just want the confirmation that they are, which is fine. We're happy to have that conversation with you and just reaffirm the fact that what you're doing is correct. And we have a conversation with the landlords that thought they were okay, but really we're not. And we've stepped in and helped them out with our landlord rescue plans. So, don't turn a blind eye to it. Don't put your head in the sand and hope it goes away. Deal with it, because these fines are coming. So you need to make sure you are fully compliant.
I think that's the key point. I think most people think they've got it covered, and actually when you look into it, there's several things that they haven't done. And those things come with a big price tag if reported to the council or to the data protection, or there's a bunch of stuff that can catch you out that most people aren't aware of. So it comes without judgment. Most people are not fully compliant in every area. It's very, very difficult to be. There's so much to do now, and everybody's busy. Everybody's got a career and a family. It's hard to check all the boxes all the time. So we totally understand that. Okay, I think we're pretty good to wrap up then, unless you've got anything else, Ross.
No, I think I was quite happy with that first run through, to be honest. Fairly seamless. Everything seemed to work apart from the links going out.
The link, we need to go and have a look at that. Invitation link, that seems to be a bit of a problem. But yes, we'll send the recording round, and anybody that's suffered with that, again, we are very sorry. Yeah, this is hopefully going to be a regular thing, ideally quarterly. And we'll vary the subject depending on what's going on at the time. But yeah, thank you for joining us and taking your time on this lovely sunny summer's evening. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.